This week in Pure Reinvention.
But what it also meant was that people were actually ready for a change around the table, but there was nobody who was willing to spark it.
Episode 159, Part 1, Case Study of Impression 5 Science Center with Noah Smith, Partner, Capital Services.
Engage, disrupt, adapt, repeat. You're listening to Pure Reinvention, the podcast for curious people.
We're here with Bonifer Ballard, Executive Director of the Michigan section of the American Water Works. And Bonifer, this was a really interesting conversation we listened to, wasn't it?
It was. It actually made me somewhat uncomfortable the first time I listened to it. I had to listen to it a couple of times.
You know, you mentioned that, and I'd like for you to just expand upon that a little bit more as we prepare everybody for this podcast, which is really awesome.
Sure. Well, having this case study and taking us through all 5 steps was helpful, but I didn't make it through all 5 steps in the first listen, mostly because I found my mind wandering back to my own organization and some of the issues that perhaps I'm not doing correctly in these steps, and found myself having to rewind and re-listen to the podcast.
So the opportunity for everyone to kind of wander as we think about the application is exactly what we want to have for these podcasts. One of the things that you mentioned, Bonifer, that was meaningful to you was disruption is an option.
Yeah, I loved this concept in the first part of this case study, that disruption wasn't forced upon them, like some of the other things we've heard.
Out of necessity.
Right. Yep. That he recognized it as an opportunity, this coalescing of feelings among the board members.
Yes. And then, of course, how you spread ownership.
Yeah. Really interesting case study. I think people are really going to enjoy it.
Let's listen.
This week's episode is sponsored by MB Strategies. MB Strategies focuses on your success and provides you with sustainable results by identifying opportunities, guiding you through implementation, and navigating you to greater results. Contact MB Strategies today at mbstrategiesllc.com to start your reinvention journey.
Welcome to this episode of Pure Reinvention. We're here with Noah Smith. Noah is a partner with Capital Services. Noah, thank you so much for agreeing to be a guest this week.
Yeah, absolutely. It's nice to, be back.
Well, you were a guest well over a year ago.
Yeah.
But we have some new news to talk about, and that's why I wanted to have you back to talk about, as a result of the really hard work you've done in a project that you have done in your spare time, Impression 5 Science Center. Mm-hmm. We're going to really skip to the 5th step in the Pure Reinvention process, which is move, and talk about the awesome award you've gotten as a result of the hard work you'd have put into the president's role. Talk a little bit about that award, what it meant to you, before we go back and talk about the hard work to get there.
It's difficult to put into words what that award meant to me. It meant everything to me. It's nice to be rewarded for good works that you do, though it's not necessary, and it's not why I do those good works, right? It's not why anybody does that stuff, largely. But to be recognized in such a spectacular fashion, it's such mixed emotions. Do I deserve it? It was a team effort, and so many people poured their hearts and souls into this, and so, is it fair that I'm the guy who gets recognized in such a spectacular fashion? But to have this beautiful painting that was put together using people's words of their impressions of working with me and with Impression 5 was astonishing and emotional. I was on a high for an entire quarter on the thing, and I still frankly am when I think about it. When you bring it up, it still makes my eyes a little bit misty to think about it. It was a tremendous honor.
It's beyond belief.
Yeah.
And unlike other awards where you take these home and put them on your mantle, this award is hanging in the Science Center to honor the leadership of a huge reinvention project. And so that award came on the final debut of a significant exhibit that never would have taken place had a number of years ago, I'm going to say 5 or 6 years ago, you became president. And it was at that time that you decided that the Science Center was ready to go to the next step.
Yeah.
And so you had a chance to lead through a period of time where the Science Center was ready for your leadership, ready for the energy that was about to be put into it. And because the 5 steps to pure reinvention are so evident through this process, let's walk through those steps and let's have our viewers listen to your description of those steps. Many times we talk conceptually about things, and it's so nice to be able to talk about a specific project, specific results, and the application of the 5 steps, and then what we were able to accomplish because of that.
Yeah.
But the step 1 in the pure reinvention process is disruption. So can you speak about the disruption that needed to take place within this business in order to allow it to start to migrate to its next level?
So I think that Impression 5, when you and I both started on Impression 5, there's a catalyst, right? Like you can't just disrupt for the sake of disrupting. I mean, that's what movies are made out of, right? I mean,
that's a little chaotic.
That's right, exactly. That's Godzilla, right? He just disrupts for the sake of disrupting. And that's not what this was. What you and I saw, I think, was that the climate was right for disruption.
In a positive way.
There was a feeling around the table, an energy around the table that people weren't understanding. And what that energy was all of the conversations that we had at the board table. We do our little updates. Here's what we're doing, and here's some of the nice stuff that we got going on, et cetera, right? The conversation, if you remember, would always devolve into, wouldn't it be great if?
Right.
And so we'd spend 45 minutes on, wouldn't it be great if? What if we had an exhibit that did this? What if we had an exhibit that did that? What if we could? And that, to me, that was one, it was sort of disruptive in and of itself because it took focus away from what we were supposed to be focusing on at a board meeting. It lengthened it unnecessarily. But what it also meant was that people were actually ready for a change around the table, but there was nobody who was willing to spark it, right? How do you upset that apple cart? Things are really comfortable. And, we need to be better off financially than we really are. And so to grow is super scary right now because there's a lot of uncertainty about whether or not we can, and it's risky. So instead, we can stay in this comfortable space, right? And so we had these comfortable space conversations, but there was always that undertow. Wouldn't it be great if? So people wanted more. And it just took a moment to realize, well, if that's what they want, that's what we want too. We want to change the nature of what our board discussions look like and change the nature of the Science Center to go away from wouldn't it be great if and go towards we can actually do this kind of stuff. So it was time to tear it down, I guess, metaphorically and physically. Right?
So you're talking about creating new patterns.
Right.
And so part of that new pattern, or part of why new patterns don't get developed, is we kind of have this annual changing of the guard, where we have this annual change of presidency. But there was a decision made that we weren't going to do that, that we were going to freeze your presidency. And that indeed is a disruption from traditional protocol.
Right.
In order to allow the leadership necessary to exhibit itself and to flourish itself to build the business up. Talk about that disruption.
Sure. So, and it wasn't really a political risk. It just sort of happened organically. But it harkens back to the old cliche, you don't change horses midstream, right? Mm-hmm. So when we really started that, it's time to reform both at the board level and at the center level what Impression 5 does and is and looks like. It made sense for there to not be a change in leadership because you need to see that project through. And it was organic. It wasn't like we had to do this presentation before the board and cross our fingers and be really nervous about whether or not people would reject it. People just came to that realization around the table because we had a structure that was great. And everybody around the table was bought into what we were doing. And everybody around the table had a role to play in that. And so I think because of those things, it wasn't politically risky. It wasn't like there was somebody who was waiting in the wings to say, I can't wait to get this guy out of our way so that I can do my thing now. No, we all had this direction and everybody bought into it. So everybody bought into the disruption. And so the disruptiveness of making the political decision to freeze sort of what the leadership looked like, I think ended up being easier than we ever would have anticipated it would be because it just kind of fell into place. It was so necessary for it to happen.
Now, sometimes there is the situation in which the operational side of the business does not want the disruption and they are kind of comfortable with the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
And so the disruption many times happens externally.
Mm-hmm.
But what we found was there was also an interest in having some disruption internally as well, but you needed to foster that out. How did you encourage that out?
When I talked earlier about energy around the table, right? The questions that people were asking, the conversations that we were having were actually a cry for, we want to do something different. I feel like Eric was exactly in the same place. What Eric needed was to just know how to be an executive director and a leader.
And in a growing
That's
dynamic space.
That's right. Because at the time he was an executive director, but just sort of bailing the ship out. You know what I mean?
Yes,
doing what he could
absolutely.
do to keep it afloat. So he was a jack of all trades.
Very busy, very
Yeah.
engaged, but still very much just
Right.
trying to hold it all together.
And he's surrounded by this incredible team of people with great intellect. And what a waste it was to have all of that talent and all of that passion and energy built into just staying afloat.
Mm-hmm.
Eric was primed for this very same type of disruption too. He didn't need a lot of pushing to get him to the place where it's time to take the risk and it's time to start tearing down walls and it's time to redo what we have and it's time to rethink what your role is. What Eric said in return was, if I'm going to do this, then I need mentoring. I want some experience around me to help me grow as a leader internally so I can deliver on the things that you need me to do and deliver on the things that I and the center need me to do to meet this new thing.
So you're segueing into step 2, which is the role of ownership.
Mm-hmm.
How did you see ownership exhibiting in itself at both the operational level and at the political level?
So again, I think the board as a whole, was really eager to own a new project. We had a lot of passionate folks around the table who have been on the board for, a million years. We had a lot of new blood at the table
Right.
that had actually started to communicate about, what are we doing? And, I sit on this and it's kind of nice because my kids go here, but, where are we really headed with all this stuff? So when we started to present to them, let's, talk about where we want to head the center. Let's talk about, how we want to have new exhibits. Let's talk about making some of these things a reality. It was ready to go. The board decided to own it. I think there was some board level ownership also, in our committee structure. We kind of did away with and we talked about this in our first podcast together. We sort of did away with the traditional board committee structure, right? Where you have this communications committee and they only focus on this, and you have this fundraising committee and their job is to open up everybody's wallets. And, we recognize that nobody loves doing that kind of stuff. And it's an old way of thinking, right? Nobody likes being on the fundraising committee. Everybody rolls their eyes and they have to do it and they write their obligatory check and they call it a day. And they're not really driven to try to make something bigger and better out of
Right.
it. But instead, if you just say, no, the fundraising is on the community and the making the money is on the community, not on us. And what we have to do is foster relationships and foster ideas. A fine example of ownership, and I think you had a podcast with her too, is Kate Snyder.
Yes.
She decided to own it. And so her ownership sort of helped evolve what that committee process looks like by having this sort of changing committee. Its root is in how we drive people to the center. And so quarter by quarter, 6 months by 6 months, year by year, that focus might change. That might be, how do we get new bodies in the door? How do we get new members? How do we get more people from a broader region to recognize what the center is doing? So the questions change, but the focus is always the same. How do we get more people in here? So by having a not rigid structure, Kate and her committee of people bought into their goal. How do we own this piece of the business, which is how do I, form this committee of really great volunteers to own driving people to the center, off and running. Keon Zeller did the same thing. How do I own getting this center up to speed, up to snuff on the very basics of fundraising so that we have a certain amount of money that comes into the center that runs the center and everything else can focus on the product that we put out, right? So that the center doesn't have to scramble for keeping the lights on and paying its staff anymore. So, once Keon has that goal in mind, her committee can do whatever it wants to do around that. So those are a couple of examples of how I think at the board level we had ownership. I think there's two other examples though, and one is the Brain Trust. the thing that we call brain trust that most other people call an executive committee, right? And that was our and Eric's mutual ownership of this disruption.
This was
process.
the mutual mentorship that you were talking about earlier.
Yes, that's right. The mutual mentorship. That's what we call the brain trust. And so again, what we did is we formed a committee of folks who've had long experience in nonprofit management, and in management types of mindsets. And we walked Eric through, how are you going to structure your workday and your staff's workday? How are you going to structure your job and your staff's job to point us all in this direction of growth that we're going to experience, right? What are the trappings of an executive director? What do you have to know? And what are the things that you have to look at as an executive director, right? So not the minutia, but what are the big things that you have to look at?
Right, which
so
I think was a big shift for that individual.
It was, because Eric by necessity was focused on all of the things.
Right.
He was wearing them out.
And when you focus on the minutia, you don't have the space.
Focus on the big stuff. That's precisely what he did. So the Brain Trust trained Eric, mentored Eric, and gave Eric a really safe place to bounce ideas.
To learn and to grow.
And learn and grow so that he could steer that ship, right? And,
yes.
And so he agreed to that. In fact, asked for it. He's the one who asked us to create that special committee. And that's key, because that's his ownership of this direction. That's how he took ownership of it.
And that was critical.
I want to do this. Train me.
Bonifer, our listeners might be wondering where steps 3, 4, and 5 are in our case study of the Impression 5 Science Center. That will be in episode 160. This is 159, where we're focusing on steps 1 and 2. So as you kind of digest 1 and 2 and you're ready for 3, 4, and 5, make sure you listen to episode 160, where you'll get the rest of the case study journey. But Bonifer, I want to go back to a little bit of this teaser that you started the podcast with. This made you a little uncomfortable.
It was particularly difficult to listen to the entire interview for the case study and not apply it to my own organization.
What you mentioned was that you recognized in this particular case study that disruption was a positive option that was available for the organization. And it was done to set a whole nother kind of set of accountabilities.
Right.
And you began to wonder whether you were indeed disrupted to the point where you had new accountabilities to help yourself grow.
I loved the analogy that disruption wasn't disruption for its own sake. So, we don't want to be Godzilla coming in and creating chaos.
Creating
I loved that. But recognizing in Impression 5's case that the board really was at a place where they were wanting it. Even if they didn't know it, they didn't ask for it in so many words. But Noah really recognized that that was the opportunity.
And it really takes a key individual to recognize the option that is available.
Right.
And then there's a really next important step too, really, isn't there? Which is step 2 in the reinvention process, which is ownership. Right. Spend some time on that, because that's so critical.
Such an impressive individual Noah is. This ownership piece was key. And part of how he demonstrated ownership was committing to staying around as a volunteer of the board. I find that inspiring. It was a huge, not only in his ability to own where the organization was and where he wanted it to go, but really taking ownership in his role in getting it there. One
of the challenges to creating ownership is when you have this annual change of leadership at the board level, right? Where every year your bylaws may say that you have to have a change of presidency.
Right.
And it became critical that if Impression 5 Science Center was going to reach its full potential, that they had to stop that transitional leadership and move into a strong leadership relationship between the leader of the board and the leader of the operational side of the business. That partnership was then allowed to develop, to take advantage of meaningful disruption for both of those individuals to own their respective sides.
Yes.
With each being different and important.
Right. I loved really how all of this came together. So the ownership piece really was across the board, but particularly with Noah and Eric. I think Noah's vision and really getting people all to the same place so that they could all own it and move into the next step is really important.
What would you say, Bonifer, after listening to this podcast, was Noah's vision?
Well, I think he said it early on. It was that doubling of revenue, right? And so he really, I think even his vision was somewhat simplified. Part of it was really led by this, wouldn't it be great if exercise the board kept going through, right?
Yes.
I
And
think
that was the real vision.
Right.
Right? The doubling of revenue was a means to get to the vision, but
Right.
the real vision is Noah and his family are consumers
Right.
of the Science Center, and they were owning the understanding, wouldn't it be great if?
Right.
Well, in order to make that happen, what would we have to do? Which then makes
Right.
you go back and say, okay, if we had a little stronger revenue stream, if, right? And that creates that engagement and that ownership at that particular leadership level because they were consumers, because they had direct awareness and understanding. This wasn't a one-off or a 10-off kind of relationship. This was a very intimate awareness of what it was and how important it was to the community, and a really realistic awareness of where it is today.
That's so well said. I think the wouldn't it be great if was both the disruption and the vision, right?
Yes.
So he could take all that he had learned from listening to those wouldn't it be great if conversations
Yes.
and really help the organization to see where it could go.
The ownership that was necessary started at the political level with the board president,
Right.
and allowed the operational leader to take that disruption and that opportunity and in a very positive way find a way to respond so that everything within that business started to move up.
Right. I thought it was wonderful to hear that not only did Noah reach out to Eric, and Eric was responsive in that way, so Eric really owned the opportunity himself, but there's even though he doesn't go into it in detail, there's an acknowledgement that all of the board and all of the staff were part of that process.
Yes. Make sure you stay tuned to episode 160 where you'll hear the rest of the story. And remember, if you're ready for a change, make it a change that lasts. Make it pure reinvention.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Pure Reinvention. Keep the conversation going and get alerts when new podcasts are up by following us on Twitter at Pure Reinvention or sign up for our mailing list at purereinvention.com.